Hello, everybody. This is BeerSmith Podcast, episode number 96. It's late January 2015. And this week, Mitch Steele, the brewmaster from Stone Brewing, joins me to discuss trends in India Pale Ale. Thank you to this week's sponsor, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They're now offering a full 6 issues a year, up from 4 at a great discount. They're offering a new discount code now, which gives you 15% off everything in their store, including subscriptions and training. The new code is BeerSmith 2015. I encourage you to check out this great new magazine for homebrewers at beerandbrewing.com and use the offer code BeerSmith 2015 to get your 15% discount today. Also, I encourage you to check out BeerSmith, available from beersmith.com. You can take a test drive of the desktop version for 21 days by downloading the free trial from beersmith.com. We also have extensive tutorials, including a huge recipe site and mobile version integration. You can find these by watching the videos at beersmith.com/video. Grab your copy of BeerSmith today and start brewing your best beer ever. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, my guest is Mitch Steele, the brewmaster at Stone Brewing Company, and author of the book IPA, an Indian Pale Ale. Mitch is a graduate of the UC Davis Fermentation Science degree program and has been at Stone since 2006. He was a guest way back in 2012 for episode number 49. Mitch, it's great to have you back on the show.
Yes, wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me.
So it's been over 2 years since we last talked about IPAs and Stone. What's new at Stone Brewery?
It feels like something new comes along every week. It's like, what isn't new? Last year we set a record for number of beers that we released. It was 120 different beers through Liberty Station and through our special release program at Stone, and new beer introductions, year-round beers and seasonal beers.
You did 120 beers in a year?
Yeah, 120 different beers.
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it's it's staggering. I think that's 2 new beers a week basically, and we felt every minute of it. I think it's been a fun ride. It's lots going on. We've announced the plans for the Berlin brewery and also Richmond, Virginia. Mm-hmm. We're really putting a lot of focus on doing the design work on those 2 facilities right now. So that
you're going to put one in the DC area for me too, right?
Yeah, I wish. I know that was kind of that would have been looked upon favorably by our owner. But yeah, I guess Richmond's close enough. But
yeah, I have to drive all the way to Richmond. That's like an hour away or something.
Oh my gosh,
it's awful.
Sorry.
So
a lot of new beers and a lot of big projects going on.
And it's been a little over 2 years since your book came out too, I think, right?
Yeah, it's we're entering into year 3 right now.
So year 3, how'd the book sales go?
They were really good. It was a really nice surprise, to get that first royalty check. I expected not much. I expected to get some beer money, maybe a little play money out of this. And the first year I sold so much that I was able to take the family on a week-long trip to New York City. Wow. So that was huge. And then since then it's tapered off, of course, as other things have come along and people have bought it and everything else. But it's still, it's doing well. And I get a lot of good comments about it, which is very gratifying.
Well, you wrote the book on IPAs, which is our topic today. IPAs have really been exploding the craft beer market the last few years. I noticed that Stone's brewing no less than, I think, 5 IPAs year-round now, which makes it it's almost half your year-round IPA releases, I think, right?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, year-round releases total.
Yeah, everything is some sort of version of an IPA. It seems like these days. It's interesting, and I see it not just with us, but with a lot of brewers. And one of the things that I think is fueling this is just people's palates evolving and really getting a taste for hops. And the number of people I see in establishments that may not know a beer but will order the IPA first instead of the pale ale, to me it's increased quite a bit, and it's a very interesting thing to observe. I know when we release beers, and we do a lot of what we call special releases, one-off beers, if it's an IPA, the sales numbers are fast and furious, and if it's not, it takes a little while for people to latch on to them.
So, I mean, what percentage of your beer, I mean, roughly, does your IPA make now?
It's about 40%.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah.
Well, I also noticed that your flagship Arrogant Bastard Ale has spawned quite a few spin-offs.
Yeah, we've been brewing Double Bastard Ale for a long time, and we've done that every fall. But we also, over the past few years, have done some other things with the Arrogant Bastard beer. We've done a beer called Lucky Bastard a couple of times. That's a beer that's a blend of Arrogant Bastard Ale and Double Bastard Ale, and then also the oaked Arrogant Bastard Ale. And then we've done beers like Crime and Punishment, which are aged in barrels and have a whole bunch of hot peppers added to them. And those are
Mm-hmm.
Lucky Bastard base and Double Bastard base. And we just came out with a bourbon barrel aged Arrogant Bastard Ale, which we're really excited about. We've got a warehouse off site about a mile away where we have about 7,000 barrels, I think. And we're running Arrogant Bastard through the barrel program and bringing it back up to the brewery and bottling it, and so that was exciting. We're gonna do that full time here pretty soon. So we did it as part of a mixed pack in the fall, and it was very popular. So we're looking at trying to make that a year-round brand.
So how big is Stone now? How big is Stone Brewing roughly?
I just saw the numbers from last year: 287,000 barrels.
That's a lot of barrels.
It's a lot of beer.
That's more than I brewed last year.
Yeah. When I started at Stone, we did 48,000 barrels the first year, and last year we grew more than 48,000 barrels. We grew about close to 70,000 barrels.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, it's.
I know craft beer as a business has been growing like almost 20% a year, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's the last couple of years it has just exploded, and you see that with just the volume numbers, and you see it with the number of breweries that are opening up. I think San Diego County has over 90 breweries right now, which is amazing. And then I think there are another 20 or 30 in planning. So it's not slowing down at all. It's just taking off.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, what are some of the trends? Let's get back to IPAs. What are some of the trends we're seeing in IPAs these last few years?
Well, I think one that's really kind of been a home run for a lot of brewers is this whole session IPA thing. A 4.5% IPA that's hopped like either an IPA or a double IPA.
Pretty light, right?
Yeah, pretty light in alcohol. A normal IPA usually runs 6-7%, and an Imperial IPA is over 8%. And to brew one that's at 4.5%, that's a bit of an about face. And it's hard to do those beers because the alcohol, having a higher alcohol content, you get a different hop character than when you have a lower alcohol content, and so it takes a little bit of work to dial in your hop profile. So that's one thing I'm seeing. There's a lot of breweries that are brewing great ones that are really nice. And we came out with one last year that's very quickly became our number 3 selling brand, and that's Stone Go-To IPA. Mm-hmm. Some of the things that we've been playing around with IPA, there's actually quite a bit, but new hop varieties are driving a lot of it, and there's a lot of great new hop varieties out there. And if you're lucky enough to get your hands on some, you can come up with some really unique and interesting beers. The other thing is using ingredients in addition to hops to flavor the IPA. Mm-hmm. Things like, we did a beer last year that had coriander and elderberry in it. It was called Collective Distortion IPA. It was a collaboration brew we did with 2 musicians. And, we did a double IPA for our 16th anniversary that had lemon verbena as an added dry hop ingredient. So, we're playing around with that a little bit. I don't want to take that too far because I still think IPA is all about hops. But, just to add a little flavor complexity, I think is kind of fun.
Now, what about some of the dark IPAs? That seems to be a burgeoning area as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we came out with a black IPA in 2007 for our anniversary, and then we started brewing it as Sublimely Self-Righteous Ale a little bit later than that, a couple of years later. And really we've seen that struggle to really take off as a style.
Hmm.
It doesn't seem like it's a go-to beer for a lot of people. It's more of a novelty. So, we're just wondering what the future is of the black IPA. I love them. I think they're a neat style, but God, I think it still there are some elements or of intimidation when people are faced with a dark beer. And you see that with porters and stouts, and you hear it all the time when you talk to people that are not overly familiar with beer, and they're like, oh, I don't like dark beers, I don't want to try that. And then they try it and they were like, wow, that's really good. I had no
Hmm.
idea dark beer could taste like this. So, I think there's a lot of that that's still out there, not among educated beer drinkers and brewers, but amongst the general public. But we did a brown IPA last year that was a lot of fun for our anniversary, and we used
Interesting.
yeah, we used an English malt in that. It's from Simpson's. It's called coffee malt. My understanding is that is the dark malt that's used in Fuller's London Porter, which is what piqued our interest in it. And so we brought some in and
So,
played around with it.
so how dark is that? How dark is the coffee malt?
It's like a light chocolate malt.
I see. So yeah,
Yeah.
something at 300 range maybe or something
Yeah,
like
yeah, it's not quite as dark as a standard chocolate malt, but it's darker than like pale chocolate malt.
that. Hmm. Well, I wanted to get into some more about brewing some of the new IPAs, but I was wondering if you could share a little bit of history of IPAs. I know it's a big focus in your book, certainly, to provide some perspective.
Yeah, it's certainly, when I was writing the
I think
book,
it's almost half the book, actually, right?
yeah, the history sucked me in to a huge level. I figured I'd be writing a book about double IPAs and West Coast IPAs and things like that, and the English history of the IPA I think is fascinating, and it's a lot different than what people think. So, my take on the history of IPA, and there's a lot of gray areas here, and people have made a lot of assumptions, but in general, back in the 1700s in London, there were brewers that were just starting to brew pale ales, and that was because the pale malt was developed in the late 1600s, and it
Hmm.
took a while to kind of take off amongst the brewing population in London because they were all porter brewers. But eventually, in the mid 1700s or so, brewers it became fairly widespread in London to brew a pale ale.
And a lot of
And
that had to do with the malting process, right?
absolutely, it was all because of the malting process. This technique of using coke instead of coal or wood fire to kiln malt allowed for better temperature control and a lighter color development. And
Right.
so
I
this,
would have guessed before that most beers were probably smoke beers, right?
yeah, yeah,
Because
that's what most people
they were
think
malted over
is
wood. Yeah.
yeah, they were kilned over wood or some other heat source that peat or whatever, and so there was a smoky character to them, and and then the resulting beer, a lot of times was aged for a very long period of time at the brewery or at the tavern before it was tapped to just tone down the smoke, and the
Hmm.
pale malt allowed that to kind of fade away. So that's really what drove the pale ale brewing um, uh, phenomenon in London in the 1700s, and there was a brewer there.
Hmm.
The Bow Brewery, Hodgson owned the brewery. I think his first name was George, but he owned the brewery. He was located right next to the East India Company, and was able to give their ship captains beer to take to India. And most people feel that was the first real beer that became the India Pale Ale. Interestingly enough, as Hodgson had this relationship with the East India Company and kind of had a stranglehold on the market of beer being shipped to India, he was also shipping porter, and porter did just fine according to most accounts. So the myth that the IPA was the only beer that could survive the voyage was not necessarily true.
I
Um,
assume most of the beers were a little bit higher alcohol than we drink today, right?
Yeah, there's still some gray areas there about how strong those initial IPAs were. There are people that think they were upwards of 12%, and then there are some folks that are in the camp that it was a 7 to 8% alcohol beer. Certainly, as the style evolved and as the Burton brewers started getting involved in it in the 1800s, it became about the same alcohol content as an American IPA today, so somewhere in that 6 to 7.5 range.
Hmm.
And so the records from the 1800s are much more complete than anything you can find from the 1700s. So you can get real recipes and some of the hopping targets, and you can make some assumptions based on the amount of hops they were using as to what the bitterness level probably was. So in the 1800s, the Burton brewers they started brewing IPAs to compete with Hodgson, and they really took it to the level where the beer was actually called India Pale Ale. It wasn't before then, and they drove the processes for brewing this beer using an extremely light colored malt, and aging the beer for a year in barrels before it went on a boat. And then it did the boat ride, and then either got tapped from the barrel in India or got bottled. And it's a lot of interesting things about the 1800s IPA, but to me,
they probably didn't have a born-on date on the keg at that time, right?
Not at all, And in fact, if you look at some of the documentation,
it's probably a year and a half, 2 years old at that point.
Yeah, it specified how long the beer had to be aged before it could be put on a boat. It's
that's funny.
Really, really, totally different process than what we American brewers are doing with India Pale Ale.
Well, you mentioned last time we talked that India Pale Ale doesn't really have to be as complicated as some people make it out to be. What could you give us an example of a simple IPA recipe? I think a lot of people try and throw everything but the kitchen sink in.
Yeah, and we do a little bit of both here at Stone. To me, you could brew a great IPA with a single malt and single hop technique, and using a pale malt and using just a really nice
so like a smash beer of some kind.
Yes, exactly. I think, and we do that here at Stone in our research programs. We've got a 5-barrel pilot brewery here, and we've got our brewery. It's 11-barrel brewery down at Liberty Station in San Diego at our restaurant there. And we utilize both those breweries to brew single hop IPAs, and they're wonderful. And not only are they very tasty, but they also give us the ability to really evaluate a new hop variety, which we've done a lot of work with that over the last couple of years. Then conversely, we have a couple of beers, the Stone Enjoy by IPA and the Stone Go-To IPA, that have very complex malt hopping schedules, and the logic for that was primarily because we didn't know how much of this beer we were going to sell, and hop procurement is a very challenging part of our job. Making sure that we have enough hops to brew the beer that we can sell. By using a lot of different hops in a beer, if you run out of one, you can make some substitutions if you need to, and still keep the overall hop impression of the beer very similar to the original. And to be honest, and I think this isn't a secret, we had to do that with the Stone Enjoy by IPA. We had to change the hopping, primarily in the dry hop. The Nelson Sauvin out of New Zealand is one of the key dry hop varieties in that beer, and we just couldn't get them. There's not enough infrastructure in New Zealand to expand the plantings of that hop. There's other breweries that are competing for that hop that have taken a whole bunch of what's available, and so we're very limited on what we can get, and frankly it's not enough to brew the amount of Stone Enjoy by IPA we want to. So we've had to make some adjustments there. We added the original dry hop in Enjoy By was a 50-50 blend of Nelson Sauvin and Australian Galaxy. And since then, we've had to tailor back the Nelson a little bit, and we've added Motueka from New Zealand and Helga from Australia to the dry hop. And it's mostly Motueka that has supplanted the Nelson Sauvin. So we've kept it in the New Zealand family. But it's a little bit different character than it was originally. But we haven't changed it in over a year, so I'm happy about that. We've settled on it. We've got the volume requirements dialed in, and we understand how much of each hop variety we're going to need.
Could you provide us with a very simple hop recipe then? I'm sorry, pale ale recipe then?
India Pale Ale?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, if I was going to do a very simple one, I would take a base malt of American two-row malt. If you want a little more malt character, maybe go in with a British malt as the base malt, and maybe just a little bit, less than 5% of any sort of colored malt. I've become very fond of using a light Munich malt as kind of a blending malt, and we have
Interesting.
a new IPA that just came out called Stone Delicious IPA that we use a combination, a little bit of Munich malt and a little bit of Vienna malt in the recipe to in addition to American two row, and I think it gives it a nice malt character.
It gives it a little color, a little flavor, right?
Yeah, a little body and a little color and some a little bit of a toasty character to complement the hop character a little bit. We've gotten some comments that it's a very malty IPA, which I don't necessarily agree with. I think it's a very hop driven IPA, but the malt character is a little more present than it is in some of our other IPAs.
So this is the delicious one. Is that it?
Yes, Stone Delicious IPA.
Yeah, there we go. I just pulled it up on your website there.
Yeah. So that's been a fun one. But in general, when I look at putting together an IPA recipe from the grain standpoint, I look at using 95% of a base pale malt and then maybe 5% or less of anything else. And I don't go above 15 degrees Lovibond crystal on the colored malt unless I'm trying to make a darker IPA for whatever reason. But
yeah, a lot of people don't know when you get to the darker crystals, a lot of times it adds almost an acrid flavor.
Oh yeah, especially when you get above 80 Lovibond crystal, you can really get a lot of that. And the one thing about crystal malt, and I've gotten a reputation over the years for being a crystal malt hater, which is not true at all. I just don't like crystal malts in IPA. But the malt characters, the beer ages. When you have crystal malt in an IPA, it starts turning into a raisin character that really, really covers up the hops. And so that's why a lot of brewers have gotten away from using crystal malts in their IPAs.
Makes sense. Well, a lot of breweries have also been pushing the limits on hops, and we talked a little bit about it already, but driving more and more IBUs into their beers. Can you really taste the difference in bitterness beyond a certain point, though?
No, and the number that I hear discussed is about, once you get above 70 or 80 IBUs, any incremental increases in IBUs are not perceptible.
So some of these 300 IBU and 200 IBU and, insane IPAs.
The other component of that is you can't get that much bitterness in a beer anyway from a chemical standpoint, from the biochemistry of it.
Right. The hop utilization goes down pretty dramatically beyond a certain point.
And then a lot of it will drop out as the beer ferments because of the pH change and the yeast absorbing some of those hop components. And so, one thing that people don't realize, a lot of people don't realize, and it's becoming more common knowledge now, but as you brew a beer and if you have 100 IBUs in the wort, you're going to end up with 70 in the finished beer. It's you drop about 25-30% over the course of fermentation just because of the pH change, and a lot of people don't really realize that. And then there's the bitterness, the limits of iso alpha acid solubility in beer, which goes up as alcohol goes up. So you can theoretically get a higher IBU beer if you have higher alcohol, but there's a limit of maybe 100 to 120 IBUs.
And there's also a limit on what your tongue can actually perceive and taste, right?
Right, and that number is about 70 or 80 IBUs from everything that I've read. Once you get beyond there, if you go to 90 IBUs, it's not going to taste any more bitter than an 80 IBU beer. And I think brewers are starting to catch on to that and maybe toning down the bitterness a little bit.
So, do you think you're wasting hops beyond that point?
Yeah, well, it's definitely diminishing returns. Whether you're wasting hops or not is somewhat subjective. Mm-hmm. I do think you get stuff out of the hops. You get flavor components and things like that. Even if you're adding more bittering hops or trying to get more bitterness. So you may not get the bitterness, but you're going to get other components as well. And I haven't been able to dive into that enough to really have a good basis of understanding of the biochemistry behind that. But I do think, it's not as simple as saying you don't need to add these hops because you're not getting the bitterness. You might change the flavor of the beer as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, what are your thoughts on using many, many hop additions to the boil? Probably in the extreme case, you could do continuous hopping versus just a few bittering additions.
I like doing both. I don't have a preference. I think it just depends on what kind of beer we're making. I know at Stone, when I got to Stone, I was amazed at the simplicity of the hop bills. We do one hop addition at the beginning of the boil for
Hmm.
bittering, and then we do typically for most of our core beers, most of our year-round beers, we do a Whirlpool hop addition,
Yep.
and that's it. Uh,
That's what I've been moving towards actually too, is a bittering addition and then a whirlpool, because a whirlpool hop addition gives you those oils, right?
Right, and you get the flavor from them. You get some bitterness from the whirlpool hopping as well. A lot more than we imagined. In some cases we've been seeing 15 to 20% utilization from the whirlpool hopping. So
Yeah,
it's
it's highly temperature dependent. I did some research on it.
mhm.
I think at about 90 degrees C, you get about half as much utilization as you might
Okay,
during the boil, but then
yeah.
it drops off pretty rapidly when you go below that. So you got to keep the whirlpool kind of hot.
Yeah, and that means cooling it quickly, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's very interesting. So there's that simple approach that we've used very successfully at Stone, and then we've also played around with having multiple hop additions. We try not to do too many in the boil,
Hmm.
just because it's hard for our brewers, to have to run up to the kettle and dump hops in at a certain time. They're so busy that timing that can be a real challenge for them. So we try to do the bittering addition. But we've been playing around with first word additions and mash hopping additions and
I'm
things
a
like
big fan
that.
of first word hopping, actually.
Yeah, it seems to provide a really nice kind of I want to say like a gentle hop flavor to the beer. I
It's
like
kind of
what it
mellow.
does. Yeah, kind of a nice mellow hop flavor that doesn't go away. It's and the whole the research behind first word hopping is the hop flavor components are binding with malt components and aren't volatilized in the boil and boiled off.
And then you mentioned mash hopping. I actually haven't done a lot of mash hopping, but it seems like not a great idea to me. I don't know.
I think it kind of depends. Uh, the first word hopping thing, I think is a little more effective, but that's just based on my gut. And I've got
Hmm.
no analytical backing to really uh, verify that. But we've done mash hopping too. I'm not sure you get much out of mash hopping, to be honest. And every time I hear the conversations about mash hopping and even first word hopping, it's very hard for a lot of people to really discern that because the beers that they are brewing with these techniques are also dry hopped, and I think that
Hmm.
pretty much takes the prominent role in the hop profile. So one of the things we want to study is first word hopping only, and what does that do to the beer, and it versus a traditional kettle hop and whirlpool hop. So
Yep.
that's something that's on our list of things that we'd like to research a little bit more.
Yep. And then obviously you're a big fan of steeped whirlpool hops to capture those fragile aromas that tend to boil off.
Yeah, we use a lot of whirlpool hopping here at Stone, and I think it's a wonderful technique. Really get nice hop character. In many cases, it eliminates the need to dry hop, and just gives you a great hop flavor. And I remember when we brewed the very first batch of Stone and Joy by IPA,
Hmm.
and we taste our fermenters every morning, just to make sure that the fermentations are proceeding and the yeast aren't producing
Well, you got to have
anything.
something for breakfast too, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. That's kind of our, then we pour it in our coffee and have a really nice breakfast drink. But one of the things that I remember from that first batch of Stone and Joy by IPA is that it was just hoppy as all get out. And when I tasted it, I was like, "Hey, this has already been dry hopped, right?" And I was told no, and I went and looked, and sure enough, hadn't even been dry hopped yet. But man, it sure had a lot of hop character in it before we dry hopped it.
Yeah, I can't remember. I think there's 4 or 5 major hop oils. We did a whole episode on it a while back that make up most of those volatile hop oils that boil off if you boil it for any length of time.
Hmm.
And those are the
Yeah.
ones that really come out in the whirlpool.
Yeah, and they really just hang out there, and they're they get scrubbed a little bit through fermentation, but they're there for good, and that's why we like doing the whirlpool hopping addition.
And then the proper role for dry hopping.
Well, I think dry hopping is essential if you're brewing an IPA. It's definitive of the style. You need to dry hop an IPA. How much hops you use and what kind of hops you use. That's all brewer discretion. When I first started in this business, and I was seeing dry hopping rates of about a third of a pound per
Mm-hmm.
barrel. And I'm sorry I don't have the conversions for more of a homebrew scale, but if you compare, a third of a pound per barrel back in the early 1990s was kind of the standard for an IPA. And right now, if you're not doing a pound per barrel or more, you're missing the boat on what people are looking for in India Pale Ale. And I remember having a conversation with Julian Schrago from Beechwood Brewing a little while ago. And he did a collaboration beer with us last year that was really wonderful. But he told me he doesn't brew a single IPA that's less than 2 pounds per barrel in the dry hop, and we've got a couple that are 2 pounds per barrel, but certainly not all of them. So I thought that was a pretty amazing statement.
Yeah, I'd have to do the math, but that sounds like a lot of hops to me.
It's a lot of hops, yeah. And if you're running a production brewery and you start throwing that many hops into a dry hop, you're going to lose a lot of beer through that process. The hops just soak it all up, and you can't recover it. So that's something as a production brewer you have to understand and pay attention to. But that said, I like the flavor of doing a 2 pound per barrel dry hop. That's basically what we're doing in Enjoy By and the Stone Go-To IPA, which is our session IPA, but we hop that with a double IPA or an Imperial IPA hopping schedule.
So when do you add your dry hops to the fermenter, and for how long?
That is an excellent question, because there's a lot of different ways to do that.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of people have a lot of different ideas on that. What we do at Stone is after the fermentation is just about at terminal gravity, we will chill the tank down to 62 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're coming from a starting point of 72 degrees Fahrenheit. We'll chill it down to 62, and what that does is that gets our yeast to flocculate out, and we can pull the yeast off the fermenter so it doesn't interfere with the dry hop process at all. And then we will dry hop the beer. At that point, we go through 3 rounds of circulations on the tank, and then we chill the tank.
What does that mean? What is for those of you that don't work with big tanks? So
basically what we're doing is we're taking a hose from the side of the tank, running beer through the hose to a pump, and then pumping it back into the bottom of the tank. And the idea there is to keep the hops suspended in the beer, or resuspend the hops. And there are brewers that use CO2 for that. They'll bump a little gas in the bottom of the fermenter and just float the hops a bit, and that works really well. Kind of
circulates the beer through the hops, and
keeps
them floating, right?
Yeah, keeps them floating, and theoretically gives you more hop character than you would if you didn't do it. I remember seeing a very interesting study that suggested that if you do a continuous circulation on a fermenter that's got hops in it, you get all the hop character you want in less than 24 hours. And I thought that was a very interesting technique. It's not something we've really played around with a lot. We've tried it, and it gave us a little bit different hop character, which is why we kind of put that on hold. But it's an interesting technique, and it would help reduce our fermentation cycles a lot. But
so then, how long do you leave it on the hops?
So we leave it on the hops for a minimum of 5 days. And again,
that's quite a long time.
Yeah, that's a long time. We want to make sure that and part of that is it takes 3 to 4 days to get our tanks completely chilled, and then we like to give it the tank a little bit of time for the hops to really settle out and solidify in the bottom of the conical bottom of the tank.
Because I know a lot of commercial brewers have been moving towards shorter hop times, sometimes as little as 24 hours to 72 hours, maybe.
Yeah, and I think that's a very effective technique. We haven't done a lot with that because it really impacts how much beer we can recover off the fermenter, because the hops are really suspended, and it makes the filtration process for us very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, I want to switch topics now back to black IPAs and talk a little bit about some of the dark variants. How do you achieve the right balance of dark malts in these variations and still maintain the hoppy flavor?
Yeah, that was the challenge. I think what we ended up doing is we used dehusked black malt and in our black IPA, and that was something that
That's interesting. So that cuts a lot of the bitterness out, probably.
It cuts all that acridness and bitterness and some of the intensity of the dark malt as well, so the hops can really shine through.
Right, because otherwise you're going to lose all that hop flavor to the coffee flavor or whatever.
Exactly. The flavors, the coffee and chocolate cocoa flavors don't really mesh well with hops and tend to cover them up. And I got that idea, and I don't think I'm original with that. I think other brewers have the same approach, but just from the Schwarzbier brewing technique and how much a Schwarzbier tastes like a
Mm-hmm.
Pilsner. And that was kind of my aha moment when coming up with our black IPA back in 2007. I'd tried several versions using chocolate malt and light chocolate malts, and I wasn't getting the hop character that I
Mm-hmm.
wanted. And when I moved over to the dehusked black malt from Germany, I got it. And there are other dehusked black malts out there now. There's the Midnight Wheat Malt from Brice and things like that make wonderful black IPAs. But to me, that was the key. And using it at about anywhere from 3 to 5% of
Mm-hmm.
the entire grain bill.
So it's not a lot then.
It's not a lot. It's just enough to give it some dark color. And the big knock on some black IPAs is they're too roasted, and that was something we tried to avoid.
So either dehusked or wheat, dark wheat, right?
Right, right.
Interesting. Well, we touched on this a little bit earlier too, but there's a whole bunch of new hops entering the scene the last few years. What are some of the hop variants that you like for brewing IPAs?
Well, I tell you, I'm a fan of the classic hops. I love Centennial. I think Centennial
Centennial's great.
the best IPA hop out there. We have some people on our team that really love Simcoe as well. We've tried to focus our newer IPAs on new hop varieties just to create some interest and get people excited about the beers, and it's fun for us as well, and that's important. So the Stone Go-To IPA focuses a lot on the Mosaic variety and Citra. And we've been using Citra for a few years now in a beer we call Ruin 10, which
Citra's
was our
got that nice fruity flavor.
Yeah, it's just amazing fruit and citrus character. We use that in a beer we brew every year in the springtime, and love Citra hops. The one thing about Citra hops is they fall off very quickly. So once you package the beer, that's one of those hops that just doesn't stick around for very long, and that was something pretty interesting to learn. The New Zealand hops tend to stick around a little.
So you don't want to age that for a year and a half on the ship to India, right?
Yeah, yeah, that would be the wrong hop to use for that, I think. But I tend to not like the real dank hops, but I tend to focus more on hops that have some interesting fruit character to them.
So sort of a Northwest twinge here.
Yeah, or New Zealand, because New Zealand you get that tropical fruit, the pineapple and the mango and some of that peach character, and I like that a lot too in an IPA.
So those are some of the ones you've been experimenting with then, huh?
Yeah, it's probably easier to name the ones that we haven't been experimenting with than the ones we have, because we've really done a lot of work on this over the last couple of years.
I'm sure some of it's supply and demand too, as you mentioned earlier.
It certainly is. We haven't been using Equinox here at Stone because we couldn't get it.
Hard to get.
And I know that's the new hot hop variety, and we like the hop. I'm not sure we like it as much as we like Mosaic and Citra, the last two that have come out. We like those hops a lot. We've also been, the Stone Delicious IPA that I mentioned earlier, we're using a hop called El Dorado in that, and that is a hop that's grown on
I haven't tried that.
It's a neat hop. It's really got a lot going on in it. It's got a lemon element. It's got almost kind of a candy bite on the back end. Similar to Starburst candy that's how it comes across to us, like eating a lemon Starburst candy. And then behind that, there's this really nice herbal and spicy component that you don't get off something like a Centennial. It's almost anise-like, kind of a licorice type character that comes through underneath all the other fruit flavors. So that's been a fun one for us.
And that was which one again? Just mention it.
It's called El Dorado.
And who makes it?
It's grown up in Yakima, and Brewer Supply Group is the supplier that carries that hop.
Yeah, I mean, like you, we tend to be at the end of the food chain as far as getting hops. So for some homebrewers, it's a challenge.
Yeah, it is, and that's a tough one. Though I think that's going to become pretty widespread over the next couple of years. I think people will be able to get it because I know that the plantings are being increased dramatically on that variety.
Oh, cool. What role does your brewing water play when you're brewing an IPA?
It's important. It's important to have the calcium content to really accentuate the hop character.
Hmm.
You don't want to use real soft water because a real bitter beer will taste kind of flabby if it's brewed with soft water. You can play around with the hardness depending on what you're trying to do, and we've done that a little bit. We treat our water to 100 parts, 120 parts per million hardness, about 70 parts per million calcium.
So you do treat it.
We do. We reverse osmosis filter our water because we're in an extreme drought situation in California.
I am aware of that. Yeah.
So what's happening is our water's coming in. It used to come in at about 300 parts per million hardness. Now it's coming in at about 450, and so we have to. That would have a major impact on our beer character.
Oh
So
yeah.
we've always shot for about 100, 120 parts per million hardness, and then we on our light
So
beers.
how do you reduce the hardness? You have to bring in
reverse osmosis filtration.
You have to filter it, huh?
Yeah, yeah. And
and of course, you can buy RO water at the store too if you're a home brewer, right?
You can, and then we don't like to use pure RO water. We like to have a lot of mineral content in the water, but we don't want it as high as it's coming in.
Yeah, I actually, believe it or not, I have to use a lot of bottled water because I'm living off a well right now.
Yeah, I had to do the same when I lived
and it's way too hard.
Yeah, it's that water was so full of manganese and other stuff. It just didn't make very good beer.
No, it's not good.
So, we add gypsum to the mash and to the kettle in our IPA process. We don't do that with darker beers because the pH in the mash with the regular brewing water that we use is just fine. But we help it along with the IPA to get better conversion.
Cool. Well, next I want to ask you about yeast strains. What are your thoughts on good yeast strains to use for an IPA?
Yeah, I tend to opt for a neutral strain. I think Stone strain is kind of in a middle ground between California ale yeast, which I think is the great yeast to use.
That's pretty neutral, right?
Yeah, very neutral.
High
really
attenuating, clean finish.
Yep, exactly. It attenuates well. It ferments well. You want your beer to finish dry, so you don't want a beer that doesn't. You don't want to use a yeast that has high attenuation limits.
You really want a yeast that does attenuate well, right?
Sorry, I misspoke that.
It does have high attenuation. I'm sorry. You said high attenuation limits. I just want people are thinking.
Yeah, you want a yeast that attenuates well.
Exactly. That's what I'm.
Clarify that a little bit, and
that doesn't not attenuate well. No, I didn't. I was joking.
Yeah, exactly.
No, you're right. You want a yeast that attenuates well and gives you a clean finish.
Yeah, you want a dry finish and a clean finish. And, there's a lot of discussion on how much ester profile you want from the yeast in an IPA. And I think that's, brewer preference and what works.
So, do you brew a lot of English style IPAs with all the fruits and esters in them or not?
We brew some, just on a small scale. The last time we did one on a big scale was our 14th anniversary beer, and that was the Imperial IPA, which was based on the 1800s Burton recipe.
Well, that would kind of make sense. Get a nice complex flavor in there, right?
But our house yeast strain is what we use for all of our IPAs, and it's a strain that I kind of put in between the California ale yeast and an English strain. It's kind of right in the middle there. So it does tend to throw some esters, but not at a level where it interferes with the hops. And I think it's a nice yeast to use.
Yeah, we haven't really talked about Imperial IPAs, but those are starting to pop up in the stores now too. What are your thoughts on that beer style?
Oh, I love them. I think it's a great way to showcase hops and really, really get a nice hop intensity. If they weren't so high in alcohol, I would drink them all the time. But I usually, if I'm drinking,
now you just have them for breakfast, right?
Driving. Yeah, right. Yeah, just breakfast.
Well, Mitch, I want to give you just a minute or two to talk about your book on IPAs. I know it's been out for a while, but it's still, I think, the definitive resource on IPAs.
Well, thank you. It was a long time coming. The research part of doing this book was just amazing. I mean, it was probably one of my highlights of my career. I think a lot of people don't understand what goes into a book, actually. Oh, it took 3 years, and
Incredible.
fortunately, Stone supported this with some trips to England to do the research, and Steve Wagner, our co-owner, went with me on some of these trips because he's a beer geek like me, and we learned so much. And the people in England, this is where I did most of my research, was in England. They were absolutely amazing. I mean, just the enthusiasm they showed for this project, trying to, our efforts to get the story right and get it straight. I mean, people just gave up a lot of time and hosted us for a lot of events and things. And, that the help I got from people in the industry in England and also in the United States was just amazing. And it was a very nice thing. And I felt really, really good about that, that people were so helpful. I wouldn't have been able to do it without everybody who helped me on it. And, like you mentioned, it's heavily focused on the history because I think a lot of that is out there, but it's not in one place, and people still have a lot of misconceptions about what the India Pale Ale was and how it was developed.
Yeah, the first half of the book has a lot of IPA history, but the second half is just packed with great stuff for brewers.
Yeah, I tried to put kind of a summary of my thoughts on how to put together a good IPA, and I got a lot of recipes from a lot of great brewers around the country and also internationally, and so I tried to include those. The one thing that I wish I could have done a little bit differently was how the recipes came across in the book, and as a take-home lesson on this, you got to provide a 5-gallon recipe, and I didn't.
Yeah, that makes.
I didn't want to do that because I wanted this to be a resource for professional brewers as well as home brewers. And I figured if you're a home brewer of a certain level of skill, you'd be able to take percentages and build your own recipe from that. But that's the one negative I got on the book. And if we ever do another edition, I'll probably reformat the recipes. But that said, the recipes that I have in the book, I'm very proud of. I've got some really great beers in there, and the brewers that were willing and actually sought me out to have the recipes included in the book, I thought was just great.
Well, thank you, Mitch. I wanted to ask, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, it's just, it's such an exciting time to be in this business and be involved with beer. Even on a home brewing level, it's taking off. Our homebrew club in the town where I live is huge, very active, and a lot of them have become good friends of mine, as it was in New Hampshire, when I was involved in home brewing there. I think it's a great scene. I am looking forward to the Homebrewers Conference in San Diego this June.
Oh, I can't wait.
Yeah, I think that's going to be wonderful, and we're going to be brewing some special beers for that, I believe.
Are you guys going to have a booth? We're definitely going to have a BeerSmith booth again.
Yeah, I'm not sure, with the alcohol laws in California, if we're going to be able to do that this year. Things have changed. It might be like Michigan last year, where a brewery can't have a booth at this event. But
actually, no. Last year we had breweries with booths. It was the year before we couldn't have them.
Okay,
it varies. You're right, by state law and so on.
So we'll see. I think if the opportunity is there for us to have a booth, we will for sure. Just kind of depends on how things play out. But we're gonna try. We've got a couple of people that are speaking there, including me. And
I'm speaking again as well.
Oh, good. So that's great. I think it's a wonderful event. And I've told the people at the Brewers Association this. I think that National Homebrewers Conference is the best event they put on every year, and that's putting it against Great American Beer Festival, Craft Brewers Conference, Savor. I like this one the best. I think it is the funnest conference. The technical talks, I think, are fantastic. A brewer any level can use those talks and make better beer. And just the people that are there are so enthusiastic about beer. I just love it.
I'm looking forward to it. I was trying to pull up the website here. It looks like it's going to be, I haven't got the dates here, I think it's around the 13th of June. If you go to ahaconference.org, you can pull up the dates and also the tickets for the National Homebrew Conference, which this year is going to be in San Diego. I think it's at the Coronado, isn't it?
I think it's at the Town and Country.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, the Town and Country Conference Center. That's right.
Yeah.
So that'll be a great event. I think the tickets go on sale usually in early February. Does that sound about right, Mitch?
Sounds about right, yeah.
Yeah, somewhere around there. So ahaconference.org. Anyways, thank you again for joining me today, Mitch. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely, Brad. It's been fun. I always enjoy talking with you, and hope to see you soon.
So today on the show, again, my guest is Mitch Steele. He's a brewmaster at Stone Brewing Company, and he's the author of the book IPA on India Pale Ale. Mitch is a graduate of the UC Davis Fermentation Science program, and he's been at Stone since 2006. He was a guest way back in 2012 for episode number 49. Thanks again, Mitch.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Thank you to Mitch Steele for joining me today. Thank you also to our sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, now offering 6 issues a year and a 15% off everything in their store. Head on over to beerandbrewing.com and use the coupon code BeerSmith2015 when you check out to get your discount on this great new brewing magazine. For regular listeners of the podcast, I remind you that you can listen to all 96 episodes of the BeerSmith podcast streaming 24/7 at beersmithradio.com. And you can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes in both audio and video formats. Just search for BeerSmith in the iTunes store or go to the BeerSmith blog to find the links. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.